Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we're obsessed with creativity and we celebrate it. We try to talk to cool people and find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University. I also run the nonprofit 1455 Literary Arts. You can find out more about me at seanmurphy.net. But probably the thing I savor the most about my various roles is having the opportunity to interact, collaborate with, and talk to amazingly brilliant people. And today is no exception. I am so delighted and, yes, honored to be joined by my friend Sarah Trembath. Let me read her bio and we'll jump right in. Sarah is an Eagles fan from the suburbs of Philly who currently lives in enemy territory in Baltimore with her family. She's also a writer on faculty at American University and both reviews books for The Independent and serves on its board. She's written extensively for other publications, and in 2019 was the recipient of the American Study Association's Award for Independent Scholars for her social justice writing and teaching. In 2023, at the age of 54 years young, she earned her doctorate in education policy and leadership. Her collection of essays, which I want to hear more about, is currently in press at the Lazuli Literary Group. Sarah, first of all, thank you for being here. Secondly, congrats on all this exciting stuff that's going on.
Thank you.
And I'll just tee it up by saying you and I have definitely tangled in the past via 1455 and at Marymount in American, but we had the very serendipitous occasion to connect recently. You were kind enough to invite me to speak to one of your classes, and the topic revolved around invitational rhetoric. And we were just saying before we came on, like, it's probably never not a good time, certainly in contemporary things, but with what's going on in the world right now being on fire, what better opportunity? So welcome. If we want to jump right in, I would love you to tell us about invitational rhetoric, what it means, what you're teaching, and how you're using this, among other tools, to help guide students through kind of how to engage in a world that is not getting less crazy.
It was really beautifully said. Thank you so much for having me, Sean. I always enjoy talking to you.
Likewise.
Um, so I guess I think of invitational rhetoric, honestly, as an option. Writing teachers like myself, and I would say most people who engage in anything persuasive in the public eye, we think of being persuasive as like trying to make somebody believe what we believe. Um, and to the degree that we engage other viewpoints, we do it so that we can assail them. I mean, it's literally how rhetoric is taught, right? Like,
Yeah.
you have to know enough about what the highly binarized other side believes so that you can counter it, right? Like,
Yeah.
but invitational rhetoric uses things like storytelling to offer people the opportunity to explore your point of view. And so the language tends to be less imperative, right? Like I'm right, you're wrong. You have to listen to this. It's really saying like, come sit with me for a moment in my thoughts and consider with me this thing that matters to me. And my students really love it. I think it suits the Gen Z mindset, which is both quite fierce um, and a little bit more willing to be vulnerable than Gen X is, and certainly than boomers are.
Sure.
So it really suits this generation well. Like they love storytelling. They're very interested in visual rhetoric, of course. And so the idea of just sharing and inviting people into spaces to listen is really important. But what I also find is that people are more willing to listen when they don't understand or agree with your point of view, when the rhetoric is more invitational than I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I even love the name invitational
I do
rhetoric
too.
as opposed to I think our default setting in America is confrontational rhetoric, and it's a zero
Mhm.
sum game. It's about winning the soundbite or winning the argument. And there's just this lack of a willingness to engage. Certainly, we can talk about how developing empathy helps people understand someone else's point of view. But I think what's particularly fascinating, so I think on a societal level, right, this is good work and necessary, timely work. But then we start getting into the art of writing and storytelling and how to do this artfully or through art and students understanding how to navigate. Like we would teach a political science major perhaps differently, how to debate and how to win those arguments versus how do you persuade, especially if you're not in the room, when the art is exchanged. I think it's a combination of personal skills that are developed, but also this rhetorical kind of creative skill set that you're helping students sharpen.
Um, I think that what you're asking me is when I'm working with students, how would I sort of convince them that this is a viable rhe- rhetorical choice? Is
Yeah,
that
I mean, I apologize. That was a long-winded preamble. I guess
no,
what I'm
I was
saying
into it.
it at once, I think I'm reiterating that society needs this. Our
Mm,
Gen Z can and should utilize this, I think, to have more fulfilling engagements. But I think the stakes are a little bit higher because specifically in the classroom, we're dealing with students that are by the choice of the class they're taking, indicating I want to be effective. I want to be effective at this. And we're getting out of kind of social media with I'm in my feelings and what I say matters. Like we want to create forums for those conversations all the time, but to teach and encourage some folks to be even more effective at it requires, I think, some shepherding, and that's certainly
yeah.
something that you're an expert at.
I think that as a writing teacher, we I teach that it's important to consider the rhetorical context. So certain types of speech are going to be, and writing, of course, are going to be effective in some places, and certain, ways of persuading and engaging are going to be persuasive in other circumstances. So for like somebody who's in law school, right, they're going to have to they're going to have to learn the way that people do it in that field, right? Which is certainly not as invitational as other forms. So the way that I teach is that you have these different ways of engaging thought and reaching people and listening, and handling conflict and all that kind of thing. And the more of those that you have, the more that you choose from. So it's very different than the way the academy has gone for most of its time, because the academy, I think, is used to, up until quite recently, like there being one way of doing things, right? And rhetoric is thousands of years old,
Right.
right? Like persuasive rhetoric goes back to ancient Greece, right? Like
Yeah.
my whole field of rhetoric and composition is based on this tradition, right? So the idea that you can say I in a piece of academic writing is like, gobsmacking. When I was, I graduated, uh gosh, I don't know, like quite a long time ago, like in the 90s,
Yeah.
and I was literally told that you can't use I in this because we're objective, right? My one of my degrees is in psychology, and I very much remember being told that
Yeah.
and think, oh, I have to strip it out. But the idea of objectivity is BS, right? And so in postmodern America, right? post multicultural America, right? Like we know that there's no such thing as that, right? So teaching that as a myth is really important. So it's much more honest, I think, to say like, okay, the idea that I'm being objective and I'm right is garbage. So let's connect on a different way. But also to be realistic, like in your field, this might be the convention, and so you might have to switch up.
Yeah, and you know, I have to add what I love that, Sarah, and I certainly agree. I think what I kind of sardonically would offer also this tradition going back thousands of years presupposed an honest, open, and intellectual engagement. A lot of that in America in the 21st century has gone out the window, and it's all about appealing to one's emotions, appealing to their, you know, their wallets, and again, this zero sum game where it's like you may have a very limited opportunity to engage with someone. So the more effectively you can reach them in places where they're going to respond positively, it suits the purpose. So it might be less satisfying, it might be harder work for the communicator, but I think it yields better results. So we don't have the luxury of, you know, ancient Greece where there's a kind of intellectual debate and the exchange of ideas was sacrosanct. It's like we're trying to eliminate healthcare, or we're trying to describe why woke is killing society. It's like we need to counter that with arguments that don't just say, well, you're an idiot, you need to do your history, you need to do your research. Like we need to find ways, I think, to effectively present narratives that counter that stupid kind of very white patriarchal viewpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the patriarchy because the term invitational rhetoric was coined by feminists in the late 70s. Um, yeah, you said so many things.
Sorry.
That's okay. You know, when you the first thing that I wanted to speak to was, you know, you mentioned that we all are trying to like we're responding out of our feelings, right? And like, you know, we just want to be right. So that's how the post-truth era is defined, right? That I'm not sure how I feel about that term. I'll speak to that in a moment, but like the idea that we're living in a post-truth era in which emotion and identity have been proven to be more important to people in forming opinions than fact and reason, as you mentioned, that has happened within the past 7 or 8 years. And so scholars of rhetoric are calling it the post-truth era. The reason I don't like that term is because it suggests that things were true before, right? Like that cultural biases didn't exist, that propaganda didn't exist, and
Right.
it did. But what the term post-truth suggests is that truth matters less to people. Like they don't even really people aren't necessarily concerned with that. They're concerned with group identity and they're concerned with how a thing feels. You know, Stephen Colbert coined the awesome term truthiness,
Yeah.
which I love, but also hate in real life. But
Right.
I mean, I'm constantly trying to figure out how to have conversations with people around this war that we're in, right?
Yeah.
I have these students who Jewish students who are taking positions on the side of Palestine, and their families are literally turning their backs on them. I have numerous students who cannot go home for Passover because of the positions that they've taken. And what I find interesting about that and totally devastating is not the difference in opinions, but in the fact that when somebody who you love shows up with a well-informed opinion that's different than yours, the like the fact that you can't even hear that your group identity and your commitment to your prior opinions
Right.
and your emotions, right? There's so much trauma in in Jewish society that I think is informing the Zionist position, right? Um, that you will shun your children.
Yeah.
Like this is what you know what I mean? Like that's how deep this is that like I've had kids, the kids in the class that you visited
Yeah.
sobbing
Yeah.
the other day in class because what they uttered doesn't match their family's opinions. I had a kid last semester who was threatened with being disowned. instead of speaking, not because she was going to go off and fight in Palestine or anything, but because of how threatening her opinion was.
Yeah. 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 And I think, as we apply this either to, the academy or politics or society or all of the above and more, I think what's being lost in this exchange is like a willingness to have a level playing field and engage with ideas. And I think one of the things I've harped about for years, it's caused me a lot of like anguish, is there's one political party that has a handful of very simple rules and it's all about feelings and the gut. And a party that has a wider tent, accommodates different types, is trying to change with the times. And it's a lot harder to stay on script and win these arguments when you're trying to bring everyone else along. And it seems we're in terms of narrative and story, it's such an important time to impress upon the people that are fighting for an inclusive or a more and ever inclusive society, how important it is to craft messages that are at once engaging and open and invitational, but also persuasive. I mean, it's a lot of work to do to make the world more inclusive. I know it's always been thus, but I feel like that's the most important work we're doing now as teachers and artists.
Yeah, and there's just been such a massive pushback because of how successful prior generations have been in expanding narratives and diversifying narratives and being inclusive. I just teach my students that it's a pendulum swing, and we're just in such a weird and terrifying place right now. Things that I believed, I think naively, were in the past
Yeah.
are just coming back with such ferocity. Um, but I do think that to the degree, well, one of the things that I focus on with my students and also in my own scholarship is um, a population in any situation that's called the movable middle.
Mm.
I think it's a human resources term or originally, but I learned about it through my allyship with queer activists. And I noticed they were using this term like movable middle. And I was like, what is that? And it's the idea that there are um, people who are just not persuadable to your message. And that's not who your message should be geared towards. Like, that's
Right.
frustrating
Right.
and useless. But that there are people who either have the personality trait of openness,
Yep.
or they're undecided, or they're interested, they're willing to listen.
Yep.
That's the population that it in when you have an opportunity to choose your audience, that's the target. And those people I think can be brought in with storytelling, right?
Totally. And I think that's a little bit what we talked about in the class I visited,
Mhm.
this notion of, look, we can acknowledge and be realistic that, you're not going to be able, no matter how eloquent your argument, there is a certain sector that you're not going to reach. But I think one of the skills that we try to develop, and I certainly am always trying to refine, is we need to be careful that we don't shut down potential dialogue by not leaning into the possibility of engagement with that movable middle. And I love that term. Again, I think that is a skill that gets developed to somehow invite an open dialogue,
Yes.
uh lean in with empathy, and openness. And then if you find that the message isn't resonating, I mean, you do what you can. But I hate to see conversations not get off the ground because the way the invitation is being offered is not sufficiently engaging. I think, then we're really shooting ourselves in the foot if we haven't learned some of those skills.
Yeah, and it's good for us creative writers too, right? It's like our craft is valuable beyond entertainment. It's like I love the blend of storytelling and my own invitational rhetoric tends to be when I write creative nonfiction, I like to bring poetic aspects into it, that the things that I either don't want to describe with research and statistics, or the things I really want you to get close to, I can deviate and I can go into figurative language and poetry. Um, and it suits my personality really well, but I think it's also more effective, but it's so different than I was taught. But um, it's just to me, it's very liberating as a writer.
It's a great word. And I want to talk a little bit more about your writing. Like we can and should keep circling back to the teaching and your own kind of, your personal political engagement. But let's talk about how you have or continue to, what's changed. How are you accommodating this growing skill set? And how do you, what are your goals? And how have you found this playing out in your essays, for instance, in your creative nonfiction?
Um, well, I think that what's fascinating is that some of the things that I was just compelled to do as a writer, they have names now and they have venues and places where people will publish them. Because when I first met you and I was doing that reading at Marymount, I
Yeah.
was reading a piece that had visual art in it, and it was an epistolary, it was heavily researched. I think there's like 380 footnotes in that book, but like it was heavily researched, but it involved poetry and storytelling, that my sources were all narratives from various things. There's, art in there. And it was really hard to find a publisher, right? Um, there was just a small handful. I went to AWP and I looked around at all the tables for like people who were publishing what was then called hybrid, right? Publishing, and there were very few presses, and they were all small, independent, which I love.
Yeah.
Um, and so I actually independently published that, and now it has been picked up by a small hybrid independent press. That's what Lazuli is. And they're doing beautiful things with that book. But now I'm learning that, oh gosh, this way of writing is making its way into more so-called acceptable spaces. Like there's bigger publishers doing it. Mixed modality is becoming a thing in my field. Translated research is the thing that I'm geeking out over now because I've always been doing it. And it's the idea
Yeah.
of doing research academically, but speaking to whatever audience that you want, right? Like, so I can read 100 scholarly peer-reviewed articles, and I can choose to write one, or I can choose to write a poem off of that, or I can choose to post something somewhere, or do an infographic or whatever. That there's all these different modalities. And so those of us who are working outside the norm in that way, we weren't rewarded in our field, not monetarily, not by tenure, not by right. Because so for me, it's always been separate. It's like that's my artist life, that's my activist life, and then here's what I do at work. But what I'm now finding is that people have carved away a place for that in the academy, and that just this past year, like in merit and tenure, like there it's much more expansive what we can submit for that. So I'm really grateful for the writers who have been pushing the envelope on that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's beautiful to hear that. And I think what we're seeing there, right, is while the traditional, industry is consolidating and suffering, very few are prospering right now. At the same time, we're seeing these different avenues of ways to publish and engage with an audience. I think that's all to the good.
Mhm.
And I think it really flies in the face of what we mentioned earlier about the tradition and the patriarchy. And for anyone watching this that immediately recoils, like, oh God, the patriarchy, what we're talking about, in addition to with a capital P, is this notion of there's one way to write, there's one way to win over an audience. Like, first of all, that's been completely debunked at this point. But also, I think what we're seeing, right, is a lot of these narrative strategies have been utilized by different cultures and different time periods. It's almost like we're catching up to
Yeah.
what the world has been doing. This is
Yes.
not a newfangled, like, oh, these
Yes.
academics are inventing new, not tried and true. If anything, I think this is a much deeper, much more authoritatively sourced way of utilizing story and narrative. So to me, it's a win-win intellectually and audience wise. And it's, again, it's a very inclusive way of communicating.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Like I agree that um not every culture argues the same way. Not every culture speaks to persuade the same way. And as I think the feminists who I read who advocated for this and coined the term, not every gender, like there's ways that women have had to adjust to get ourselves heard. Like
Right.
we cannot always walk into a space and, be received the same way by making certain demands or whatever. It's just not how we've traditionally had to do things to
Yeah.
get things the way we want, right? That which is what persuasion is. But as you were speaking, I was thinking about this scene from Hotel Rwanda where I think that's what it was. It was that person. It was Paul Rusesabagina, and he's explaining how he was able to negotiate with people who came to genocide his people, right? And he says, well, I learned how to speak the Rwandan no. And the Rwandan no isn't no. The
Right.
Rwandan no is to tell stories and engage people and connect with people in such a way that they're eventually led to no. And the no he was talking about was no, you can't come into this structure, for those of you who don't know the story, to kill the people in it. This is a person who saved a lot of people's lives during a genocide. And
Yeah.
so each day he would go to the door and basically tell the people with no weapons, say, you can't come in this building and harm these people. But he was clear in his explanation that he couldn't just say that would have been his own life, that he had to engage people and connect with them. And I think of him a lot as I'm teaching invitational rhetoric, that it not only can is an option, it not only can be persuasive, sometimes it's more persuasive and more
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, and I think that example you just used is a welcome, like that really puts contours around some of the more theoretical things we're talking about, which is what does this mean in the real world? And it's just a great concrete example of, we artists and teachers take these things very seriously and the stakes are very high. But when we're talking about things like a genocide or real world implications that are life and death, these matters become critical. And when we see through history, the masters that have been able to move the hearts and minds, it's
Yeah.
not by chance. There's a lot going on there that involves communication and connection to emotion and persuasion. Um, Sarah, I'm curious, like, so what are you seeing in terms of the students you're talking to, and how are they grappling with and using invitational rhetoric? Is it a tool that they're welcoming? Is there a learning curve or any pushback?
No, they really take to it. They take to it, I think, more than my generation does. For my generation, of it seems different than or oppositional to or maybe even a little bit weak. you know? But for for Gen Z, I think especially I'm sure students are different everywhere, but
Yeah.
my students are they value empathy and they value self-care. And I mention self-care because it's so frustrating to engage people in debate when they're not going to listen or when the stakes are high or whatever. And I just think that this generation has been through a lot and is a little bit emotionally weary, and they don't really want any more conflict. Even in this short period of time that I've worked at AU, I've worked at AU since 2014.
Mhm.
And when I first started working there, my students were very high achieving, like driven, like argue, like
Yeah.
the way, I mean, I was even told this during my interview, like our students love to argue and they would love to debate in class. Since the pandemic, they do not love to debate. Not my students anyway.
Right. Right.
They they are much more connection oriented and they understand the language of empathy and self-care. I mean, I've seen a big difference in who young people are in the past couple of years. So they really take to it.
Yeah, I mean, very, very broad generalization, but in virtually every conversation I have with fellow professors and people in education, academia, the art world. Again, very broadly speaking, but speaking as a fellow Gen Xer, I would say that what I've noticed and celebrated is that the younger generation is much more empathetic, much more
Mhm,
able to communicate. I think the
mhm.
knock, and I'd love you to elaborate and maybe disabuse this prejudice, is that but they lack a resilience. They lack a certain aggression and persistence to get things done. And I think you just started to locate one of the reasons why, which I just want to underline and kind of high five. Like, they've been through a lot. So
They
first of
have.
all, we need to calm down. We just got through a pandemic. But what do you, just again, generally speaking, what do you say to someone, whether it's me or just rhetorically, like, better on the empathy, no question, these are more sensitive people, but maybe there's a fragility there. A, is that wrong? And B, if that is somewhat true, what are we doing to equip them?
Oh, that's a really interesting question that I've given a lot of thought to. Um, Gosh. So this is a generation that is demanding that we respect what they want to be called. It's a generation that expects trigger warnings on things. Um, and those two things are already in my ethics, right? Like I've always wanted to call people what they wanted to be called. And before the term trigger warning came out, like I just I would say to my students, look, this is upsetting. You can put your head down if you want. Like that's just common sense. I think what is difficult with either with this generation or with the fact that I'm getting older and I don't like young people telling me what to do is the way that they say it can be, very like, you know, defensive or demanding, right?
Yeah.
Um, it can feel that way to me. And I also that's part of me being in my generation. Like my generation, like we're the hip hop generation, we're the punk rock generation, we're the grunge generation. And for my generation, like my thing is like, who you talking to like that? Like, are you disrespecting me? Like our whole thing, my whole subculture is like, don't you know who I am? Like, you better respect me, right? So
Yeah.
for me, as the older person in the equation, I have to recognize like what I'm going through when I'm being told by somebody half my age how to
Yeah.
speak to them. But I think that makes things like invitational rhetoric even more important. Like I literally like 3 days ago had an enormous conflict with a student. I forgot to give a trigger warning about a really brutal scene in Chimamanda Adichie's Half of Yellow Sun. I mean, I literally just forgot.
Mhm.
And instead of speaking to me like, Professor, that was a really upsetting scene. Why didn't you do this? She came at me with all kinds of accusations and
Eesh.
thinly veiled threats and all kinds of stuff. And I mean, I had to wait like a full 48 hours before I responded.
Yeah.
And then we were able to sit down. Um, I think that has to do with youth, right? Like my students are 19 years old
Yeah.
and they're learning how to navigate situations like that.
Yeah.
Um, I do think that this generation sees less of a difference between what I would call authority because look, they spent 2 years talking to us in our living rooms, right? I think that that's huge. Like when I went to college, like my professors were just like on a whole different level. I would have never spoken to them in any way other than their title.
Yeah.
Everything was their decision. It was their decision whether they wanted to speak to me or not. Like I had to go find them and wait in the hallway if I wanted to talk to them. Like, but things are blurred. My students are emailing me at midnight on a weekend and they see where I'm sitting when I'm on Zoom. Like it's a very different generation. So I think part of it's on me to sort of recognize who they are, appreciate them where they are. I think that I think we have yet to see whether they're resilient or fragile. I
Mhm.
frankly think they're much more realistic than we were. I always joke with them when they're impressing me with their empathy
Yeah.
um, and their commitment to mental health. I always joke and say, well, my generation just used to break things and smoke cigarettes. We're all in 12-step programs, like
Right.
I was, and half of us are dead, and so I say, like, I'm certainly not going to look at them and be like they're weak. I think they're onto something because we had the same feelings that they do.
Right.
We just pretended, right, that we had everything under control,
Right.
but I don't really think we did. When I look at my youth, I feel like I'm really lucky that I'm alive, I guess the way we handled things.
Yeah, I mean, here. I totally that totally resonates. I think the only thing that I, especially in an election year, the only thing that I really worry about and am trying to, in my own way, make sure I'm handling is it always kills me a little bit when I see any obviously sensitive, intelligent, younger potential voter that just is disengaged because of
Yeah.
that built-in cynicism. On one hand, I mean, I couldn't have more empathy and understanding. Like, sorry, we're created this world for you to inherit, but at the same time, I guess, and it really does come back to the invitational rhetoric on a personal level. Like, how do I infuse enthusiasm and make it clear to some of these younger folks that you have to be involved, you can't disengage, because my own personal feeling, Sarah, is that, and I've written about this, there's myriad ways to debate and argue and try to arrive, but I think it's safe to say at the end of the day, the moneyed, the influential, powerful forces want nothing more than a public that's checked out, because then they can
Oh,
go, unencumbered into
oh.
dividing and conquering even more.
Yeah, and that's actually my dissertation work is really pretty much very centered around so the work that I do as a scholar is critical reading of propaganda and
Mhm.
um, educational propaganda in particular. And the research demonstrates very, very clearly that democracy only functions when you have a critically thinking population. And so the assault on criticality that I see, and it's happening in so many different ways,
Yeah.
to me is absolutely the way that power thinks it's going to stay consolidated in the hands of the few and the traditionally powerful. So I think, I mean, it's what I teach at AU. I mean, I teach a couple things, but
Yep.
that's what I teach. I teach critical reading and and writing. And so I just help my students see the connection, right? That you know, you can only it's really liberation, honestly. It's like you can only make real authentic decisions if you understand when you're being hornswoggled. And here's how you can understand that, right? All these critical reading techniques. But the first thing we do, the first or second week of class, is we separate out affect from understanding from criticality. So my students have to read a bunch of stuff that upsets them, and then they have to break their response up into the affect. This is how this made me feel.
Right.
This is what I learned. This is
Yeah.
what I'm questioning, right? So that they're not just taking things in. And I'll never forget one of my students, their responses in class often constitute my data. And one quote
Mhm.
that I use fairly frequently is, I had a student that said, I never knew I could question an author before I took this class, which was really, like, very validating on one hand, but really kind of devastating on the other. I was thinking, this is now somebody who got into AU, right? I could
Right.
not have gotten into AU when I was 18. My grades weren't strong enough. So these are really strong students.
Right.
And
Right.
what she was saying to me is, I went all the way through 12 years of school believing everything I read that was in a book. Like,
Yeah.
so to me, to have them learn to question that is it's what's called a oh gosh, I forget what it's called, a transfer skill, right? Like when you can take one skill and apply it to other contexts, right? So if they can do that in my classroom, or they can do that with their educational materials, they should be able to do that when they're listening to political speeches.
Mhm.
Um, but in terms of engagement, I don't know, because I know that a lot of them watched people try to overthrow the federal government.
Right.
So they're jaded about democracy. Um, and I don't know how to, but they're also occupying college campuses right now.
Right. Right.
My all my money is on Gen Z. Gen Z is a really interesting, and I don't think they're soft. I think they're kind of tough. I think that they're very sure of who they are, and they're sped up with us
Yeah.
old people in the way that we mess things up. I mean, they really are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think so for me, I think that my key takeaway, kind of my mission is to help them understand the power they have. Power in numbers,
Yeah,
power in a unified voice, or yeah, I don't want to say unified because that implies, consensus, but power in making one's voice heard. And the one way to affect change is to get out and make your voice heard. And I think that's the other thing that the older folk, we don't even have to get into political parties. Like the older generations are always counting on young people aren't going to vote. It's the old people that vote. And so I'm always reminding my students, like, have no illusions. The people that are wrecking this world are still the ones that vote religiously. So even if you're just countering that by making your voice heard, that
yeah,
is a very proactive measure. So never feel that it doesn't make any difference. And I know every generation deals with this, but having
yeah,
people for very understandable reasons kind of be like, what difference does it make? And it's like, let me try to explain to you how it does make a difference.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely support that and speak to that when I can. I think it was a little bit harder a couple of years ago when we were a little bit closer to the January 6th thing, but
Yeah,
my students these days seem pretty engaged. But AU is famous for that. I mean, we have a lot of people who come and study with us because the embassies are nearby, because Congress is nearby, and that's where they do their internship. So I
yeah,
work with a little bit of a different population, the population that is really choosing politics. Like our biggest majors are public affairs
sure.
and international studies. So
Yeah.
I still see that civic engagement. But if I look at the numbers, I am aware that it is in peril.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I don't want to be facetious, but yeah, you're at ground zero in many senses of the term. And I think where my mind goes when you say that, I'm at once, relieved. I think that's good to hear. But also I think it's, incumbent upon us older folks to remind them that here's how we can use invitational rhetoric, right? Like get your friends out, make them understand that we can spend the next 4 years getting into the nitty gritty and how the sausage is made. But the first step, if there's a certain party trying to take away your reproductive, there are things you can do to make your voice heard that will make a difference. So that's the first step, and then the rest is the messiness of democracy
Yeah,
and working toward the future that we all want to see. But what my ultimate line, my takeaway line for students is the best way to make sure nothing changes, don't do anything.
yeah, amen for that.
So I think what we've arrived at, right, Sarah, and it just in this short time is we talked about, and I was grateful to hear, your insight on how you're teaching and using invitational rhetoric, but we're ending up, I think, where we should end up, which is and how are we using it? How are we learning? How are we finding better ways to, infuse the kind of enthusiasm that our professors fired us up with, you know, I'll say a few years ago. I won't say many years ago when we
It,
were younger pups. But
it
um,
was a few,
I,
yeah.
I, you know, I think the reality, right, is that the work has to go on, and we all have to be getting up and putting in the time and being engaged. Because how dare we think anything's going to change if any of us aren't, still in the game every day trying to move the ball forward.
That's right. And I think as older people, we have to realize that things change and that it's on us really to do as much instructing of younger generations as it is to listen, because our role models were the greats, right, of like the 60s and 70s,
Right.
right? And they were fists in the air, like demanding things. They were, in the 90s, as an activist, like we were linking arms and yelling, we were making demands, right?
Yeah.
And it was appropriate for the situation.
Right.
Things are different now, I think. I think things are different, and there's a lot of opportunity to bridge gaps through um, ways of speaking and engaging that we would have considered soft. Um, but I think they're onto something, and they understand the importance of listening. Um, they understand civil discourse. Like this is all stuff that's in their vocabulary that was not when I was their age. And so I think guiding them is important, but so is sitting back and listening to them and learning from them. They're an impressive generation. I'm honored to be their professor.
That's such a, I mean, thank you for that. I agree completely.
Yeah.
But I also, Sarah, I just want to say that, it is tough, right? Our daily struggles, I'll say struggles, but boy, does it give me courage and inspiration that you're on the good side, doing the work that you were put here to do. Obviously having a positive, demonstrable impact on bright young minds. And I just also want to add that I won't say that when I talk to other professors and our peers, artistic, professional, that I'm getting cynicism, but it's wearying. And so the people that are still very bullish on Gen Z and just genuinely positive, it's just refreshing. And it gives me, fuel in my tank to like be optimistic, because otherwise we're failing if we give into negativity or start to doubt the work that we're doing. The students are going to pick up on that.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and likewise, Sean. I mean, there's a reason why I invited you to my classroom, that I wanted them to know you and hear you and learn from you. I think that for those of us who are in our 50s, getting older, or whatever, it's like we have to remember that every generation is perplexed by the one that comes behind it. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
I mean, I think of watching Happy Days when I was growing up, right? And like
yeah.
the Cunninghams were perplexed by Fonzie, right?
Right,
Because he
right.
rode a motorcycle and had a leather jacket, right? Um, um, so we're perplexed by them, but that's just as much our task to as it is theirs, maybe even more so. We have to make room for them.
Yeah, and one of my fallbacks, certainly thinking with my creative hat on, is what you want to avoid at all costs is cliche and
Mm,
unoriginal thought. So it's okay to acknowledge that every generation does kind of wistfully look back and go, "Oh, these youngins," but
yes.
don't become the person that you used to make fun of. It's like then you're carrying a cliched torch.
Hello.
Like, be better than that.
Be better than that. I always swore that I would never be that, right? Like I remember when I taught high school and I was a little bit younger, and I was just, and then there were these old crotchety teachers in the building. They really couldn't stand the students. And I was like, I'll never be like that. And I
Right.
fast forward 15 years and I hear myself talking to my son, and I'm just like, oh God, I sound like that thing I said I'd never want to be. Okay, play your horrible rap music. I'll sit here and listen and shut up. Like,
Right, it's give and take, it's giving, it's learning, it's teaching. But I think what one of the reasons you're so inspiring to me, Sarah, is the balance of always having that built-in humility and the enthusiasm to teach and to learn. I think that
oh,
is,
thank you.
it's not a lost art. I mean, I think that that's something that all adults in any walk of life, any opportunity to mentor, any opportunity to listen and be humbled. I happen to totally share your enthusiasm. I learn as much from the students I interact with as I teach. And
Mhm.
that's how we stay young. That's how we
That
stay engaged.
that's how we stay young.
Yeah.
I wouldn't trade my job for anything. I mean, it's like there's a lot of it that's very stressful, but the fact that I get to go to work every day and sit among a bunch of 19-year-olds is everything. Like I would not trade that for the world. And
Yeah.
frankly, I feel a little bit sorry for people who don't have that orientation to the young people in their life. Young people are, first of all, hilarious,
Yeah.
and they are life-giving. And um yeah, it's not a one-way relationship. And they they buoy me up as hopefully as much as I teach them how to write. I hope I validate them, because my fondness for them is genuine, but they give so much if you let them, but they can also shut down and clam up, you know?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
It's just I'm on so many levels delighted to share this space with you and talk, but I think it's so clear to everyone checking out this conversation, like this is how it's done, both in the teaching profession and just in life. Being open, always being willing to learn, sharpen one's skill set while also acknowledging we have a lot that we should be hearing as well as saying. Um, Sarah, as we do, what I like, I always hate to wrap things up, but I think with us in particular, this is always a dialogue that's ongoing. So we will talk
Yes.
more. But I think it'll be really interesting later in the year to compare notes and check in on what we're seeing, both election wise and in and outside the classroom. But um, let everyone know. I'll put this in the wrap up and when we share all the information. But how can people find you online so they can check out your work and connect with you?
It's an awesome question. I'm right in the middle of transferring everything, like new web addresses, like new websites, like so right now I'm pretty hard to find.
Okay.
But I will say this, like my faculty profile, Sarah Trembath at American University, like as I update things, I'll be putting it there. But I literally just trashed everything so that I can rebuild over the summer.
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So Sarah Trembath at American University, folks, check it out and stay tuned for more. So, hey, the next time you and I talk in this forum, we can celebrate the launch of the new website and
Yeah.
also celebrate
Cool.
the accessibility of all these awesome essays and pieces you're working on. So, good luck as the semester winds down. We were talking about that before we came on. Thank you for, again, not only inspiring students and fellow artists who adore you, but really, like I said, this conversation just kind of fills up my tank. Is going to help me get through the rest of the semester. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and your enthusiasm. Look forward to continuing our dialogue as soon as possible.
I do too. Thank you for having me, Sean.
All right, Sarah. Folks, thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. You can find out a lot more at seanmurphy.net. And reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. We're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. So drop us a line, get involved, and we'll see you next time. Cheers. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.